Firstly, though, I really need to thank Ray for agreeing to talk to us this evening. For those who aren't aware, he's actually speaking from his place of work, Macquarie University, which is Sydney, Australia. First time we've had a speaker from the other side of the world. Hopefully it won't necessarily be the last. But that doesn't mean we're going to try and get you again, but we probably will sometime. Okay. For those who are new this evening, if you want to put a question to Ray, please use the chat function to do so, and then I'll put them to him at the end of the talk. The other thing you need to know, please keep your microphone muted and your video turned off. We will be recording tonight's talk, and it will be up on YouTube once it's been edited. So very briefly, I expect for most of you that actually Ray needs very little introduction. Even though he now works in Australia. You born in Reading, I think, Ray? Is that right?
No, I was born in Woking.
Oh, that was close. I'm a Yorkshireman, it's south.
Okay, I was born somewhere south.
Before he was at Macquarie University, though, he was Professor of Roman History and Archaeology at the University of Kent. And most importantly for us, he's quite rare for a British academic in his work with Roman connectivity and transport. I wish there were more who were interested in the subject, but he's one of the few and has written some fascinating work over the years. Anyway, enough twaddle from me, and I'm going to pass you straight over to Ray, and we'll make a start.
Okay, so the plan for this talk is to probably tell you things you may not know, mostly focused on Italy rather than Roman Britain, because you're all experts on that, so you don't need me for that. And mostly it will be a screen share. So I'm going to do that, and there will be time for questions at the end, but I wanted to try and pull together an idea for you of what were people thinking they were doing with roads in the center of the Roman Empire, because the articulation is rather better in words, and also in terms of the data is a bit different from Roman Britain. And then at the end, I wrote down on the last slide some takeaways for Roman Britain, but they're probably not the right takeaways, because Roman Britain, I've actually, when did I last go to Britain? 2022, I went to Britain, got COVID. And before that, in 2018, I think I was doing my dad's farewell as he died. So I haven't been back to Britain for a very long time, it would seem. Okay, so let's share the screen and we can do things from there. Okay, which one? This one, hopefully. And if that's the wrong one, or you can't see it, have a shout. Okay, first of all, because I'm coming to you from Australia, we really do believe in reconciliation with the Indigenous people of Australia. So I'm going to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land I'm on. And the land I'm on is quite interesting from the point of view of colonial history. It was named the Field of Mars by Governor Phillip, a general thing. The piece of land I'm actually on was the Field of Mars Common, which was common land for the people who were settled here, who were mostly former Marines who looked after, inverted commas, the convicts. And then in 1860, the Field of Mars was subdivided in sort of enclosure movement. It happens in Australia as well as in Britain. And there was a bit of land left as a reserve. It was kept for later. That piece of land is the piece of land which in 1965, Macquarie University was established on, 2 years before Indigenous people got citizenship here. Before then, they were invisible people. So, and we call it the Wallamatical campus now, named after the Wallamatical people, who are part of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have really nurtured this place since the Dreamtime. And we've also discovered it recently with a bit of research by our colleagues in Indigenous Studies that where we are now on the Wallamatical campus has actually been a place of learning for indigenous people for a very, very, very long time. And because it was a reserve when the Field of Mars Common was divided in 1850, 1860, it remained a place of learning right through that colonial period where we were quite horrid to a lot. Aboriginal history is not pleasant. The history of Australia is very, very brutal settler history, and we know about settler histories in our modern world. Now, let's see if we can change the slides. There we go. So, being in Australia, it's just worth thinking about road building. If you come to Sydney, you'll find just behind Circular Quay, an obelisk was set up. This is the golden milestone for New South Wales. You know about the golden milestone in Rome, from which things are measured from. Governor Macquarie set up this obelisk in 1818, 30 years after the first fleet arrived. So in 30 years, how much road building did they manage to do? And this is a really good document. The principal roads, it says. So there's a 137-mile road to Bathurst, and it is pronounced Bathurst, not even though it's named after Lord Bathurst. There's a 35.5-mile road to Windsor. There's a 15.5-mile road to Parramatta, a 20-mile road to Liverpool, a 7-mile road to the Macquarie Tower on the South Head, and then a 14-mile road over to Botany Bay. That's it. Now, road building in the colony is actually one of the most interesting areas to delve into, because it shows you how difficult it is to build roads. Roads are not easy things to build. They're difficult, awkward. Bridges get washed away. A poor man from the Royal Engineers was made chief of roads in about 1852. And he discovered that people were trying to create Telford roads in New South Wales. Famously, Governor Macquarie decided to pave some of the streets in the centre of Sydney, but the stone got stolen. I mean, that convict tradition is very much so here. The expectation of things being stolen is quite high. There's very little crime here today. But the thing which we find, though, looking at the roads, and that grand surveyor from the poor man from the Royal Engineers also built Circular Quay. It's very much so the Royal Engineers built nearly everything in the British Empire. But he explained to the people that you should actually build sustainable roads and not necessarily go around paving everything, because you might pave a very short section. There was also about 12 kilometres of railway he was responsible for, but his biggest impact was actually not in roads, it was actually introducing the telegraph to Australia. So he resigned after 2 years and was utterly fed up with people shouting at him, our bridge is washed away, can we have another one, please? So that's just as a background, just to sort of think that road building is not a simple, easy process. In Europe, we tend to accept that there are roads everywhere, and there have always been roads everywhere. But it's something to think through of quite how difficult it is. Okay, so we need to get, where is the mouse gone? Mouse is here. So if we look at a section of the Via Appia at Minturni, we have lots of excavated paved roads all over Italy. Right? The Italian evidence is some of the best in the whole of Europe. North Africa also has a fantastic body of evidence. And you can look at David French's work on Asia Minor, which is all freely available from the British Institute in Ankara. You can just download all his survey of all the milestones and the topography of roads there. So if we're thinking about Italy, we might think about the Via Appia, 360 kilometers from Rome to Brindisi, initially built to Capua, halfway there in 312 BC. Now, what did that mean, the road building? That road project probably nearly bankrupted Rome. Appius Claudius also built an aqueduct, the first aqueduct in the same year. It's a big project in which they are minting money to pay for it. It's something which is new, and it creates a concept of space which is fundamentally that from Rome to Capua, there is this thing, a single space called the Via Appia, which is a road, and it's owned by the state. This is a very, very new concept for Rome to have. You can see the beautiful straight line through the Pontine Marshes. It's aligned between the temple in Terracina and the Temple of Diana on the Aventine. This is when also that the Romans got Pythagoras for the first time, and it is a form of mathematics. You can see the rest of the road, of course, is not straight. Roman roads seldom are straight in Italy. Mostly they go up onto contours and tend to follow the contour at a high height above the river valleys. And just sort of thinking about rivers, roads, and space, I went through a number of milestones. I have a project to try and read as many milestones as possible. They're phenomenally boring mostly. This little cluster of interesting ones is about the connection between a town, let's say the top one, the Via Aemilia in northern Italy, from Rimini to the river, the Trebbio River. You can also find, if we move down a little bit, let's take the last one, the Via Claudia Augusta, paved from the Po River to the Danube. So this form of connectivity between rivers is incredibly important, and also the connection between a river in Italy and a river at the frontier. So quite often, one of the major problems of Roman archaeology is we disconnect the periphery from the center. And I'm as guilty as anybody else, because I can focus on Italy. And yes, I do read a bit about Roman roads in Britain, but I don't go into any detail. So we're going to have a think of going, well, how does the center reveal what it is about roads in Britain? I mean, the connection between rivers and roads is very strong in that sort of between Italy and the frontier in particular. Now, if we are just to go at the start of the Roman Empire, what do we know about roads in Italy? So rather than go through the full history of, then they built the Via Flaminia in 220 BC. It's incredibly boring. But let's look at this arch, and we can think about Richborough at this point, because it's a very similar structure to Richborough. This arch, which has got a bit of crenellation on it, is at the entranceway into Rimini. And the inscription, the bit which can be read, anything in square brackets isn't there. The bit which can be read is the famous roads of Italy were repaved with his money. So that's the key thing. By 27 BCE, Italy has famous roads. They adopt road building largely from a Macedonian concept of road building. And in Greece, right through the Roman period, the public roads are also always called the King's Roads, after a Macedonian concept. Or the Macedonians also adopt them from the Persian idea of the King's Road, of the King of Persia's road. So this idea of Italy has famous roads, but they are redone or repaved in the Augustan age. And we have quite a few coins which refer to road building, because we always translate this because the roads were paved. That's how we translate it. But I think we have to include within that an idea of bridge building as well, because if we look on the coins, you can see a little couple of culverts almost underneath. And it's a great coin because it's got an elephant on it, as far as I'm concerned. You can see this series gradually developing. You can find it in the Spanish Mint in Cordoba, also in the Rome Mint. And we can also find the gradual development of a concept of a bridge underneath the arch in the middle. Obviously, it makes no sense architecturally, but this is a representation on a coin. And why should a representation of a coin represent exact reality. It's something we sometimes we reconstruct every Roman temple according to what's on a coin, but what's on a coin is some guy in the mint having a huge imagination of what this could look like. And gradually it becomes slightly more realistic, because we shift from this image to where the arch is on the bridge. The arch is very like the Arch of Rimini. It's the start of a road. And by the end, you'll see the one on the right, that we've got a bridge in the middle with almost two arches at either end. And this does symbolize the idea of putting an arch at the start of a road. And you can see that in Statius's poem on the Via Domitia, where it talks about the arch being the leman of the road, or the entry point in the road. So we have a nice idea. We also have another coin from Trajan, where the Via Traiana was built under Trajan, and that's celebrated with a wheel, which gives us a very big clue about what some of these paved roads are about. They are about wheeled transport, carriage transport. And if we look into Roman law, we can start seeing how a road is associated with wheeled transport, whereas a pathway or an actus is associated with driving cattle. The architecture of roads, just to show you two examples. One is on the left. You can see, I think that's Thomas Ashby from the British School at Rome for scale. That's a large viaduct or a large embankment. You can see a culvert at the top to make sure that you don't create a dam, which is a big road problem. The scale of building there can be seen, but also on the right, you can see the bridge at Narni, built in the Augustan age. It fell down in about 1870. The middle span eventually collapsed. But this structure is to make sure that you have a largely level flat surface, so you reduce the cost of transport, the time taken of transport. Now, just to look at materials, materials tend to be fairly local. There's a preference for the dark lava stone, which you see on the right, interspersed with some limestone. Clearly, they were happy to use limestone in places, whereas further north away from the volcanics, you find limestone paving. Now, this is where we start. At what point were roads paved? We can say that sections of the Via Appia were paved in probably by 295 BC. First of all in square blocks, and then they were replaced by something called silex. And silex we associate with grey stone and white stone in the literature. And Pliny tells us that the grey stone is much better than the white stone, which we find reflected in milestones about restoration. Here we have we've got three milestones. It's fairly early, bear with me. We have got our act together on this. The first one talks about the replacement of glaria or gravel with silex, so stone blocks. And that's happening under Nerva, so the end of the 1st century AD. And the one on the right, I think, is the really interesting one, because it says the road before, which was made in useless white stone and corrupted. I mean, we always have lots of corruptus, dilapsus in milestones about rebuilding, and is put on a new basis because it's built in silex. And the nice thing about this one is it tells you how far, for 21 miles of rebuild. So again, this gives us a very clear idea of what is being attempted is a replacement of useless white stone with good grey stone. Now, in terms of how much does it cost a mile, we do have one piece of data. Now, the one piece of data this one is from a bridge inscription. It's not from a milestone. You see this, if it's square, it's a bridge inscription. This refers to the restoration under Hadrian of 15 miles of the Via Appia. Between Iclanum and Beneventum is where we got the milestones. We've got about 3 milestones. They all say the same thing. Milestones are beautiful, repetitive texts. And it cost 1,470,000 sesterces from the emperor and 569,100 sesterces. Let's call it 2 million. It's before 8 a.m. We'll call it 2 million. So it costs roughly 130,000 sesterces per mile. Now, we can think at that time, a Roman legionary is paid about 1,000 sesterces. So the payment cost of a legion, 1,000 times 6,000 is sort of roughly would pay for the equivalent of 45 miles of Roman road. It's a staggering amount of money. The emperor pays 72% of the costs, and the landholders nearby pay the rest. So this gives us quite a good idea. If we're to look at just the reference to here, we're talking about it's being old and needs to be rebuilt. It doesn't say what sort of material. One of the things we can do search for, you can use this GitHub thing if it's working. Every so often our tech collapses here. We developed an epigraphy scraper, and I just put in the word silex and its stem silic. And just to show where we have that use of hard stone, and we can find inscriptions for it. It partly depends on how many inscriptions you have. We have lots of inscriptions from Italy and Africa, more from Africa than anywhere else. But we can see that we get clusters of 54 in Africa, 62 in Italy, and then around the provinces of the Western Empire, we find other attempts to use paving stones. But then as we move towards the frontier, paving is actually not seen as a great idea. It's much more a Mediterranean concept. Now, if we look at that material, we've gone through 5 slides. Well done, Ray. One of the things which we can look at, this is the Via Amarina, which is north of Rome in Etruria. And we can see immediately that they've not paved the whole width of the road. They've only paved one carriageway. So even where we do find paving, we find limited use of paving. Now, in terms of where they get it from, and this is something which we've done a lot of work on. Well, we did a lot of work and then I moved to Australia when we didn't do anything. We wanted to look at where are the quarries for building materials? How far do you move material to build a road? Now, a lot of the existing literature up to about 1997, let's say the millennium, decided that, well, if you were building the Via Claudia, you can see on the map all the red stuff and some of the purple stuff and the sort of orangey stuff. These are all lava flows. There is a complete coincidence. You'll see the road coming south of Rome, the Via Appia, is built right on top of a lava flow. It's a lava flow which takes you up onto the Alban Hills in a very straight line. I mean, you could say it's all Pythagorean, but it's Pythagorean concept of laying out a road with the concept that there happens to be a very straight line of lava sitting there, which you sit the road on top of. So that gives us, the assumption was things came from the nearest place. This is contrary to all the earlier literature. Van Diemen in 1912 had identified this sort of stone on the right in Rome under the Clevus Capitolinus. Where we find it outcropping is probably about 50 kilometers north of Rome. So material from those lava flows up into the north of Rome, and this road is dated to roughly the 2nd century BCE, was being used in Rome at that time. Later on, we don't find that material in Rome at all, and we find everything is coming from south of Rome and the Alban Hills. And if you look at this material, it's actually much better. It's far better than the material which they were using in an earlier date. The material used at the earlier date, if you look at, hopefully you can see the pointer, this is full of crystals, whereas this material isn't. And then you can see this quarry face, the blocks literally fall out. And it's quite unlike, oh no, hang on, we will try and get control of the mouse again. Let's see if we can. It's quite unlike what we would call a basalt today. And one of the features of lava flows is the number of crystals in them varies. The reason there are ruts in Pompeii is the material is so full of crystals that it naturally erodes. It's more like this material, the top material, than the bottom material. This material doesn't create ruts, just doesn't. You can see sort of deformation of the stones themselves, but you do not find ruts forming in this very, very solid rock from the Alban Hills. Now, if we're thinking about road building, we have lost the mouse again. We need to think about how much does it weigh. Now, we've got a series of materials. We're looking at celt shape. Janet Delane did some calculations in the 1990s. They may be right, they may be wrong. I'm not wanting to discuss it, but the order of magnitude of how long it takes to process the stone, to load it on carts, is much, much higher with this material. So in Italy, their preference was for really difficult material to use and to develop paved surfaces. So this gives us a sort of idea of what they're doing in Italy is difficult, hard, non-applicable to places like Britain. Something you just do not want to necessarily do that, although there are some paved sections in Britain. We did some work in Via Biberactica, and particularly want to look at the geochemistry. Now, in this road, as you can see, as I explained to the team, we are going to take a reading on every single paving stone to create a geochemical basis for provenancing of the stone. And then Lloyd explained to me quite how many stones there were, which is nearly 1,200. Now, Via Biberactica, to pave it, needs 193 meters cubed of lava paving. It's not a particularly remarkable street in many ways. To quarry it will take 364 man-days, according to Janet Delane's calculations. So a whole year, one person can cut that out in 1 year. And then in terms of loading it and transporting it, we have even more days of people. It's extremely difficult stone to work with, and it's one of those things which they are preferring the very best. And this is sort of, we should see this alongside developments in things like the use of concrete, which you can also see in that photograph, that they're trying to do something to a very high specification. Now, the thing with basalts is they all look slightly different because of the way lava flows have cooled. So looking at them will never, ever give you any data about provenancing. This selection of stones I put in front of you, when we did the geochemistry, they're roughly from 2 places only. They look different, but they're actually geochemically very, very similar. And we had a portable XRF where we spend days in this position, which was extremely painful. And you have to hold the machine there for 90 seconds. And you get data very quickly, but the human cost to people's backs, shoulders, etc. And you also have to keep the machine cool because it doesn't like being hot. So we developed eventually having a cool box, an umbrella, but we produced tons of data. And the data shows a division. Now, just to explain, the green dots on the left are all from geological sources, and those are from north of Rome, whereas the black dots are from the south of Rome. Where we see coincidence with the paving stones, we start seeing overlaps in certain regions. And this gives us an idea about provenancing. And provenancing gives us a way of understanding how far they are moving stone, what stones they might be choosing. Now, the data, if we wanted to look at it, we try to get everything to a straight line. So the nearest, and each of these are different locations. You'll notice that for lead PB, we've got a huge spike, and that's modern pollution. There was lead in petrol in Italy up to 2003, and where we were was polluted. But the places we are seeing it come from are this area, the Vallerano Plateau, this area up the Via Appia, and over here. So we actually have stones from all of those regions in the Via Biberactica. It's built under Trajan. So very, very clear preference for stone, and they've stopped taking material from north of Rome up the Tiber Valley. So there's a big change there. Now, pinning things down was our grand objective. And we came up with two real areas. There's this one and this one. These are the supply ones for that particular route. Now they are here, or they could be here. There's a possibility they could be over here, but it's more likely they're there or there. So in terms of supply, we can say that that particular street is being paved from more than one place. The idea that you got stone from one quarry is a complete anathema. So we're beginning to understand ideas about supply, but we're not able to pin things down, partly because volcanic rocks out of the same volcano quite often look similar, even though they've come out of different geological phases. Just to give you an idea of the stone, the other thing we started looking at was to see whether visually there was a choice. I mean, you can see some of these ones have completely smashed up here. One of the interesting things of how basalt doesn't maintain itself very well once it's laid. I mean, it's something which there could be a lot more work done on. If there's anybody wanting to do studies of paving stones, do get in touch, because you're a lot closer to Rome than I am. I think you're 2.5 hours, whereas I'm 26. So we looked at the visuals to see whether they were choosing any particular pattern, to see if there were batches, were they choosing certain ones, and we're not really seeing a pattern. We did a lovely visual study. Now, we can also start thinking about, well, the relationship between Rome and the places, and looking at beyond Rome as well. Beyond Rome, we broadly see that the roads north of Rome are supplied locally. Rome is supplied mostly from the south of Rome. So we have that straight division in the geochemistry. You can see here, everything in purple is north of Rome. Here we've got Rome and Ostia. We've got another bit of Rome and Ostia here supplied from a different source. And so we can start beginning to understand supply. And we try to get the sort of most probable sources by trying to get things to a nice flat line, but you can see lead pollution distorting our data all the time. But for the closest, for Ostia and Rome, we tend to go here for the Valeriano Plateau. But we've got not bad data in terms of, we've only got 3 samples, which was not great, but we need more samples. So we need to do more work on this. This is very preliminary to start beginning to see. And the Via Appia, you can see it's very likely to be the Senna lavas, but possible Valeriano, and the lavas which are closest to it, right here. There's something weird going on with zirconium throughout our data. There's something to do with the XRF machine. And we could address that at some point. Now, quarrying, of course, is actually, there are historical variables. You can't just say we've got a source, and obviously they would have used that source. You can get very exact where you've got a quarry and a paving stone. You can get very exact data when you have one. Quite often we don't have one. One of the things which we see is free labor of convicts, and condemnation to mining and quarrying is a punishment in the Roman Empire, particularly, I mean, Caligula is quite famous for this. He runs out of convicts. But a landowner has to want to have a quarry on their estate. And there are a few social things against that. If an estate is in guardianship, you have to preserve the estate, and that might prevent quarrying. The contracting by the state for quarrying and road repair is another variable. And then there is the transport costs, and also the organization of the stone supply by the state. We explored these in an article some time ago, which is part of the Tiber Valley project, which is, it's all in there in terms of discussion of law and discussion of legal problems about making a quarry. Right, we need to hasten forward. Okay, so one of the problems with roads is they collapse. Now, the empire's infrastructure is clearly collapsing by the 2nd century AD. We think that's the height of empire, but all the evidence is that there is collapse. The Carthage to Theveste road, which has got a great series of milestones on it, under Caracalla, when it's 93 years old, has to be completely remade. So, and we see this word vetestate come up with roads, we see it with temples, bridges, all sorts of infrastructure, bath buildings. Things don't last forever. There is a mistaken concept that because, for instance, in Italy, the Via Flaminia follows a very similar course, that there is a continuity. It didn't need repairing because it was built so well. That simply isn't true. That doesn't work, because one of the people I had the pleasure of being supervising a PhD on roads in Rome, Britain, Hugh Davis, who I don't think is with us any longer, he was a former road engineer, and he said, look, Ray, however well you make something, it is going to collapse at some point. So we've got to think of our roads as material objects which are gradually degrading. And what we might see is not the perfect road surface. We may say a degraded road surface. Now, if we're thinking of where, if we do a search for inscriptions of the word road and vetestate together, where do we find them occurring? We can see them right across the Mediterranean. I do admit I didn't put Britain in for this search because I didn't think I was going to get any. There might be one someone knows of which will be there. But if we look at the Mediterranean, there's 48 in Africa. There's only 12 in Italy. It's a very interesting sort of pattern. And there are lots in Sardinia. This is one of the things which is very, very significant numbers in Sardinia. Sardinia has the best sequence of milestones in the whole of the Roman Empire. And that sequence is very, very closely dated through the 3rd century AD. The reason it's really closely dated through the 3rd century AD is the emperor keeps changing so that we can have very close dating. And we can follow where the milestones georeferenced are. Most of them are still in context. The ones in Italy seldom are in context. And we can begin to understand the process of road reconstruction by governors of Sardinia in a way we can't have evidence for that for Britain or anywhere else. Now, during the 3rd century crisis, all the epigraphers say there is a glitch in epigraphy. If you look at milestones, though, the restoring of roads does not stop in the 3rd century. So it's one of those weird things which carries on. And we can see in the legal text from the Severan times is there's instructions to governors to maintain the roads. And that carries on through the 3rd century. If we look into the 2nd century for inscriptions about road building, and I think this sequence can help you with Britain to think about what the governor's being told. We can hardly find a milestone associated with Marcus Aurelius. So the time of the Great Plague in the Mediterranean, we don't find any milestones. We have milestones of Hadrian, we have lots of milestones of Hadrian, Trajan, Nerva. They're doing restoration of roads. Then we have a gap, and then we have Septimus Severus, Caracalla, lots of restoration of roads. And then we have restoration of roads carrying on through the 3rd century. And there's plenty of milestones from the 4th century as well. Most of our milestones come from the 4th and the 3rd century in actual fact, and they're not earlier. And in Sardinia, you just have this fantastic sequence, which you can have a look at it in terms of it. Now, the words associated with collapse in old roads are dilapsum, collapsum, consumptus, neglectus, corruptus, etc. Neglentia, ruina. It's a fantastic literature of collapse. Now, if we're thinking through that the 2nd century, everything's got old and is collapsing. The 3rd century, everything's got old and collapsing. We can sort of look across to other mobility data, the data of shipwrecks, and we're actually seeing a decline of the number of shipwrecks from roughly the same period. So the period which we see the most reconstruction of the roads, we also see a drop in mobility by sea. Now, one of the things which I'm intrigued by, and this might not convince you, I've been trying to convince a few people on this one, that this is the data from the Roman hinterlands project. And it's all field survey data. It is a massive database. It's the biggest database of Roman stuff there is. But one of the things we should be thinking about, if you think through the Pontine, you see this straight line, that's the Via Appia, beautifully straight. And how does a road cause a shift in material stuff? Does it increase mobility? It should increase mobility. And we see this little spike. So the road is built, I mean, these graphs are very difficult to read off because people don't publish them with a decent scale. So the road is built roughly here, 312 BC. Much later, we see this peak. But if we look for just the data from the Pontine region, we see a much bigger spike there. So we might say that spike is caused, one of the causal factors is the building of the Via Appia. But the causal factor isn't instant. So if you were to transpose this idea to Roman Britain, you would be thinking, okay, well, very few Roman roads ever get dated. So if we built a road, let's say 100 AD, what effect would that have on mobility? How long does it take? And I think we can start thinking about a time delay from road building to mobility affecting material culture. So this is very preliminary. I'm hoping to do some more work with, we've got some anybody wants to do a PhD partly here in Sydney and partly in Groningen in the Netherlands, we have funding to work on this data. So we have lots of data about the idea of mobility and change. And if we see the increase in the number of sites in an area as a factor of mobility, rather than seeing sites as things which are static. Now, our identification of sites, for example, in the Tiber Valley, all of those dots are actually referring to paved roads going to sites associated with paving. So one of the things we might think through is field survey data depends on pottery, which is not made on the site in most cases. All pottery distributions and the identification of sites is a function of mobility. So we could say that roughly here, we have a change in mobility with the number of sites. So 8th century BCE, roughly when donkey proliferation comes in, we're still good for time. We have a dip, we have another peak here, and then we have the massive expansion in the sort of imperial period outside Rome. And then we see a massive decline in the 3rd century. So that idea, that might be data for conceiving of mobility. So in some ways, if we started looking not just at roads, but at the number of sites as well, we might be able to relate those two sets of data. That's the idea. So if we relate everything together, and this is where we're starting to think through unrelated bits of study. So people who study milestones don't look at shipwrecks. People who study pottery don't look at milestones. If we put the three data sets together, we can start understanding mobility, but we have to have the three data sets. So one of my theories for the 3rd century crisis is the Roman state carries on spending money on road building, which contributes to the whole problem of the 3rd century crisis. There isn't a complete collapse of government just because the emperor is changing. Now, very quickly, we want to talk about animal power, because human-animal relations are as much about Roman roads as knowing where they are, knowing what the surface is. Now, just thinking about the mobility of animals, First World War, massive expansion of the use of sort of mobilization of donkeys and mules is an impressive thing. Now, we have quite a lot of data on the production of equids and their value. I'm not going to go into it. You can look at this once it's up online and you can pick up. But there is a market for breeding animals, and particularly breeding mules are almost as expensive as circus horses. Now, that's a staggering idea. The main area associated with the breeding of mules is particularly central Italy amongst the mountains, and Varro has a stud farm, and we have quite very good data about how to run a stud farm from Varro. So great data, largely ignored by most people, and the cost for matching mules, 400,000 sesterces. A breeding ass, 60,000 sesterces. Again, think of the legion, the person in the legion being paid 1,000 in terms of cost. Let's just ignore that. But the other thing about pack animals is we're starting to realize that they're incredibly efficient. And the photograph there of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I think it's got another donkey, 6, 7 donkeys being driven by one person. Now, that's more efficient than a cart. Now, and also discussion of how donkeys are used. The brook This report on invisible workers is fantastic reading for trying to understand how humans interact with donkeys and horses and mules to produce livelihoods. It's a fantastically interesting. Now that's one factor. So at what point do we know at what point donkeys are introduced into Britain? I think the data's not there. We know for the Mediterranean world, recent studies on aDNA, for example, have shown loosely that roughly 8th century BC, we very definitely have donkeys in Italy. And if we think back to Homer, Homer often is talking about mules. And the Priam sends a cart full of treasure drawn by mules to get Hector's body back in. So very much so, sort of this 8th century idea of donkeys and mules. Now, I want to just mention camels. I luckily went to Japan with Jacopo de Grossi Mazarin, and we had long conversations about not just the domestication of dromedaries, but their proliferation. And here's somebody who studied animal bones, quite rare for Italy. And he started looking for evidence of camels in Europe, and he found it in spades. And if you look in the Journal of Archaeological Science for the word camel, you will find camels on frontier military sites in the Balkans, camels in Hungary, and we also have evidence from Ostia for this guy, who's a Praepositus camelorum, and with these rather nice little drawings of an elephant, a camel. Clearly, in Ostia, they were importing camels. We don't think that there's a breeding population in Europe. And if you go through to the Renaissance, camels are not rare in Europe. They're not this thing which we should associate with pyramids. After all, the dromedary was domesticated almost a millennium after the pyramids were built. It's one of those most interesting things I recently came across. Now, we've gone backwards. Let's go forward. So, now the advantage of using dromedaries is that they can carry far more stuff than a mule or a donkey. They are fantastically productive. Australia now has the largest population of dromedaries. There's at least 1 million of them in the Northern Territory, and that population should double. We should point out in the Northern Territory, there's only 250,000 humans, so they outnumber them massively. But if we're thinking about the proliferation of donkeys and relating it to the concept of mobility and the number of sites in this graph, so donkeys come to Italy about here, and the number you would need by here, this is when they are starting to import camels, because the need for mobile animals is outpacing things. Okay, we've got to try and have some conclusions. Normally I conclude with this slide, but let's go for this. So if we're going to think about what does this all mean for Roman Britain? Now, if we're going to talk about roads, we have to consider it amongst a wider system of mobility. And we can think about this in terms of, we'll look at the data from the Roman Diasporas Project from Reading with Hella Eckhart and her colleagues. Migration clearly creates towns. I mean, the figures for the study of stable isotopes of sort of 30% of the skeletons from late Roman Britain in London seems to be the number of people who are migrating at that period. But if you think of the new town of London, you cannot have a new town without people migrating. So a key feature is movement and mobilities of people. We tend in archaeology to talk about sites and get worried about discontinuity of sites, but we might want to think that people are moving around rather more. The relationship between roads and rivers and bridges, someone did email me who's probably here tonight wanting to talk about fords, which I know very little about. most rivers in Italy tend to bury the Roman levels of their landscape. We actually have, well, we had until about 1944 a lot of Roman bridges which got blown up as the Germans retreated. They were replaced by Bailey bridges. You can find the Bailey bridges. Now, also the road as a thing, ideologically, it's an all-weather surface. But what is the relationship with flooding? I know somebody's here from Rochester, and I'm probably going to walk into a trap here. For reasons I'm not quite sure of, I got very interested in the excavation of Watling Street in Rochester in the 19th century. And one of the things which was very clear was it was part of the road surface was in an area which was so wet that it had to be pumped out as part of land reclamation. Now, and when we start thinking about towns in Roman Britain and also Rome, is do they really care about flooding? Rome floods repeatedly. It's a disastrous place to put a city. And we can think of the annual floods of Carlisle, York, etc. Are they just, that relationship with rivers trumps the idea of being affected by flooding? Now, the other thing we need to sort of try and think through, how many donkeys and mules does Roman Britain need? We don't have any answers for this, but it is fundamental to understanding the economics of transport. And also, how much time does it take to construct the roads which you very, very successfully map and study? Those are my 6 takeaways. But we have to think that there is an idea in the governor's head, particularly in the 3rd century, to maintain the roads. That's his job. He has no choice. That's something he has to do. There are people who think milestones are put up as ideological markers to sort of praise the emperor, but they don't work if the road is rubbish. So milestones are very real. There are quite a few milestones from Britain. You have quite a decent sample. They're quite peculiar in their own way. Okay, that's where I stop, and we can throw it open for questions and I can try and answer.
You caught me by surprise finishing then, Ray. I was
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was kind of
quite
running out of time.
unprepared. I do apologise. I think you've caught Dave out as Rob out as well, because I haven't had an email through yet with questions. So that gives me the opportunity to put one myself. Absolutely fascinating talk, by the way. Quite different to anything we've had before, and it's, I think, a testament to how good it was, in that you hardly lost anybody, which is very unusual.
Right. Okay, we've got 183. It's just like I've talked to, it's the first week of university here. So I've met 200 students on campus this week for my first year course. And also I had I think 190 online students as well. So if you want to study more Roman stuff, you can always sign up with us and do everything online.
I wish I had time. I'm sure some of our audience will, though. So thanks for that. I'm going to skip around Fords. What you did mention Fords, and one of the things I'm particularly known for, it's a bit of a bee in a bonnet as far as Britain is concerned, because we simply don't have them. They don't make military sense. There are 1 or 2 local roads which may potentially have Roman forts across, but I suspect I know who the person who's going to ask you a question is, but I'm not going to say. It would be great if someone could prove an engineered fort in Britain and prove me wrong. I did offer £10,000 to the person who could do it, and no one has, and that was 12 years ago. So, yeah, the offer's still there, guys. Prove me wrong. Anyway, that's not what I wanted to ask you. Still nothing come through. When you were talking about epigraphic references to Silex, did you split them out into urban and extra-urban?
Nearly all of them are extra urban because I put in the word via as well.
Right.
So
Okay.
putting in
No,
the word via causes you shrink the sample, which makes it slightly more bearable because you only have 200 odd rather than and this is part of a start of a new project in the sense that how do we deal with the language of milestones? I mean, the one which has the cost on doesn't use the word via. And I don't think it uses the word silex either. So the interesting part is, how do we relate? I mean, silex is a very specific word. It's a very sort of announcement of a strong material.
Apologies for that. Okay, I'll double check, Rob. Apparently, Rob has sent through a couple of emails. Sorry about that, Ray. You were saying I'll be working on my other screen while you're answering that. Here we go. It's all right. I'll keep going. Well, I've Rob's email
So
now coming in.
silex is a very special, it's a very specific word. I mean, it's a very, and also if we see that not using useless whitestone and replacing it with silex. So useless whitestone would probably be a limestone or a conglomerate in those cases. So which would just erode because they're not very strong.
Okay. I'm going to move on and away from that and deal with the questions from the audience, because there are quite a lot, as I expected. From David Buchan, and this is in reference to the images on the coins that you showed, who wonders whether they might be demonstrating the strength of Roman bridges, whether there's any allegory in that. I don't know. An elephant over a bridge and then horsemen four abreast. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I see these as arches at the beginning of roads.
Right.
I mean, building an arch at the beginning of the road, we have the Via Traiana, for example, has a beautiful arch at Benevento you can go and see. And then if you have two arches at either end of the bridge, you're actually showing that sort of the definition of the road as a space. It's like it's abbreviated the length of the road and just put two arches at either end.
Yeah. Okay. From Bob Eden, should we begin to learn from the, forgive my pronunciation, Vetustate experience and reflect on our UK pestilential potholes as a harbinger of our own decline and fall?
I think potholes are universal. I mean, I think your situation is nothing compared with here, where the recent floods have literally taken out whole sections of roads. And the level, I think we will see as climate change progresses, that the maintenance of roads is going to be much, much more difficult and much more costly.
Tony Keane
Hello, Tony.
has, and I must admit I wasn't familiar with this one. He's sent an example of Vetustate from Britain. It's RIB 2228.
RIB 2228. There we go.
So it's Vias in Ruinam Vetustate con Labsas. That seems to be it. And as far as he knows, that's the only one. I'd say I wasn't familiar with that.
But it does, I mean, it's quite neat because it shows the use of the same language. And conlapsus is just like, that's such a common word to be associated with Vetustate.
Yeah.
So it does show that sort of Britain really is part of this global culture and governors are actually using the same language in Britain to talk about roads as they are in the Mediterranean. So there's no real difference to say Britain is different. It doesn't really work if you've got example like that, because it shows this is exactly the direction, preventing the collapse of roads, maintaining roads. So whoever put the milestone up, which will probably be ultimately the governor, is actually showing that they're doing their job well.
All these are from quite different subjects, so we're moving on to Pythagoras now. This is from one of our team, but I don't exactly know who. I'm guessing it could be Rob. You mentioned Pythagoras in relation to the Via Appia from Rome to Terracina. Could you explain what you meant? I think the relationship of Pythagoras to a straight line.
Okay. The straightness of the road, you can see there is a lot of literature. Roughly, the Via Appia is built at the time Pythagorean thinking is turning up in Rome. The emphasis on that straight line, to make that straight line, you actually need to use offsets, you need to use that thinking, which is ultimately all coming out of Pythagoras.
Okay.
So the alignment over, it's more than 100 kilometers of a straight line. It's surveyed from the hills of Rome, and to be able to do that, you actually need the mathematics to go with it. You can't just do it. It just doesn't work.
We could have a whole discussion on that, but we haven't time.
We could do.
In terms of the offsets, I'm assuming you're referring to Hugh Davis's work.
Yep.
Yeah. Thought so. Which is
no burning carts or anything like that. It's like moving mobile bonfires. Don't need it.
It is an altogether different subject. I think it was certainly used in some cases, but possibly not as often as we sometimes assume.
Well, if you don't need a straight road, you don't need it.
No.
Fundamentally, there is no reason for the Romans to build a straight road unless they have some very flat land, which is unsurveyed. So you tend to see the relationship between roads and centuriation in Italy. It tends to be the road runs and the fields run at about 45 degrees to the road.
Yeah.
We don't know why, but that is a surveying pattern. And so, again, the laying out of the landscape, sort of rather different from the world of Britain, although there was that guy at University of East Anglia whose name I've forgotten, John Peterson was advocating very strongly that there's centuriation in Britain. I have no opinion, but that's something which is actually showing sort of the idea of surveying roads, boundaries. And if we look at the text of the Roman land surveyors from the 2nd century, they talk about boundaries being roads, and also the marking of boundaries, how roads can mark a boundary, how there is so much public space between the boundary of a road and your property. So that relationship is also an interesting one.
It is. I think we could do with organising a seminar on this subject, but I might talk to you about that at some point. We've got a lot to get through. From Chris Gibson, is there any evidence, he doesn't say where is meaning, but I suppose generally, any evidence of traffic management in the form of barriers? He says rising barriers. I'm not sure what he means by that. Or movable posts, something that came up in a previous.
So the most extensive study is by Eric Kohler of Pompeii. Because Pompeii, you can't drive in both directions with 2 carts. And so he's looked at particularly axle wear on the corners to show that there could be a one-way system or a preferred way of going through the city. And if you look at Pompeii, it's not so much blocking temporarily, it's actually putting a whole water fountain in the middle of the road so that you can't drive down it. Not wanting wheeled traffic going past your house seems to be quite popular. Prevention of traffic is quite popular. And if you're going to put a series of water fountains across the city from aqueduct water, you've got to put them in public space. And that's an opportunity to prevent wheeled traffic and very, very large carts. In Rome, we hear of the restriction of large wheeled carts, except for the building of temples between dawn and the 9th hour of the day, which is roughly 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
This comes actually from Paddy Lambert's talk, which a couple of talks ago, after an excavation near Corby, Northamptonshire, where they found a series of post holes actually cut into the road.
Okay.
So that's what started this idea. From Tony Keane again, what was the money for roads being spent on? Labour, materials? Would this be different in the provinces where they could use the army for labour? And would the army bother paying anyone for materials in the provinces?
I think we don't know. I mean, that's the ultimate answer. And I'm less convinced by the idea of the army is doing all the road building in the provinces. I think that model, there is some evidence for the army doing road building, but there is also evidence, if we look at Tacitus talking the speech of Calgarcus, the Caledonian, saying it's actually, we are conscripted into building roads. And the people who have, and we also see this in North Africa very clearly, the people of Kirta build a road to the sea. And it's actually funded by the people who own the land. And landowners have a vested interest in road building.
Yes.
They ultimately, the army has limited interest in building roads, very, very limited interest, because once they have a road which connects them to where they want to go, they don't necessarily want to go everywhere else. So the idea that they build all the roads seems to be quite absurd, really.
It is. For those of you who are members, you'll get to read a paper that I'm just about finishing now on work I've done in Leicestershire and Lincolnshire, where I'm arguing that over 50% of the roads are nothing to do with the Roman military at all. And I suspect the further south in Britain you get, that percentage then changes markedly. But nobody's actually done the research. Not yet. So give me another decade. Moving on. How much did, this is from Rob, I think, how much did techniques vary according to local conditions and across the long time period covered by the Republic and the Empire? Can one identify sections of road made by particular groups, like identifying which legions built particular parts of Hadrian's Wall?
I think we can't, and that's partly due to the way the data is constructed.
Yeah.
I think we have the potential to show differences of supply, but not so much difference of technique. Technique seems to be fairly similar in terms of using wedges around the individual paving stones to hold them in place. But I don't think we see a great variation of technique. I mean, we can see variation in terms of stone type, because some stones can be cut into rectilineal blocks, whereas others can't. But mostly we don't see a great variation. I mean, we see a difference between, there is a fundamental difference between a road and a forum. A forum is always paved in rectilineal limestone with a nice inscription, pavement inscription, whereas a street tends to be in black stone. So that contrast in color is very, very striking.
There are certainly lots of variations in road construction techniques here, but again, and certainly Hugh Davies recognized plenty of them, but again, it's not been well studied.
And dating is just like going,
nigh impossible. Maybe OSL will come to the rescue there eventually, but I don't know. We'll wait and see. A good question from Susan Biddle. Could the failure to repair potholes be a possibly a proxy for failing government?
I think ultimately it depends what you think government should do. I mean, I mean, today, do we think we should pay more money in tax to have beautiful roads? The answer mostly is no, but we'll have beautiful roads for free. But the failure of government, I think the difficulty the Roman Empire has in terms of maintaining everything is that it's such a large undertaking that you suddenly neglect something for 50 years and suddenly you've almost not got it.
Yes.
So washed away bridges to be restored are fairly obvious examples, but things don't just stand up by themselves. And that's something we need to recognize, that sort of maintenance. We often talk about the date of the origins of things, the date at which something was built, and then we don't think about it anymore.
Yeah.
So we know Pompey's Theatre was built in 55 BC, and we all know it's restored by Augustus, but then we stop thinking about it. And we just stop thinking about it because something else is being built. Hadrian's building the Pantheon. But it's that adding to and the maintenance that you can see through the inscriptions is constant problem of trying to restore things.
This also potentially speaks to the complexities of government. There's too often an assumption of thinking of Roman governance as being centralized, but of course responsibilities for roads were largely, certainly in the later empire, the responsibility of the local administration, not at a higher level.
Yeah, no, this is very, very precise in Roman law. Is the state roads are a state thing.
Yeah.
The city's roads are a local thing. And then there are landowners' roads, which could be private, but you can have access to use them.
Exactly.
So they're private but public.
Yeah.
But it's an extremely clear structure, and it completely devolves government. I mean, the Roman Empire is a very uncentralized structure. Everything has to be devolved, and that's its strength. Its strength is that the parts can work independently of each other, but also, as RIB 228 has shown to us, there is a global idea of what should be done. So instructions to governors, you only have to tell not many people to do something, and they go and do it. And so through the 3rd century, we can see exactly the same sort of restoration inscription language in Pannonia as we see in Sardinia. And some other governors are using slightly different language, which coincides with somebody else. But this is something which is a relatively easy thing to do in terms of instructions.
Yeah. Still got a few to get through. Are you okay time-wise?
Yeah, I'm okay time-wise.
From MH, that's not me, somebody else, who is from Rochester, and not being an academic, apparently he can safely say, he or she, that their contribution wouldn't in any way contest your theory. So I suppose that's an observation of the problems with flooding in and around Rochester. Then goes on, you mentioned, if I understand correctly, that there were more shipwrecks relating to increase in mobility. Would that have been increased due to the transporting the materials and men for building roads?
Probably not. It's probably just stuff. And we don't find road materials in shipwrecks generally. They're just not there. We things like Pozzolana sand going to Palestine short from Italy. That's as a cargo, but we don't find sort of heavy building materials going by ship.
Yeah. From Bob Edam, who's interested in the purpose of arches stroke portals at the beginning and ends of specific roads. Ceremonial, commemorative or statements of authority, or possibly all three? Is there any evidence of better quality builds nearer to the heart of the empire, and cheaper builds in the further flung reaches? So two questions really there.
Okay, so the arches are marking a start of a public space, a start of a monumental space, just as you would see entries to city points, I mean, or the Richborough Arch as the opening to Britain, basically, from the ocean. So that's an incredibly ideological statement. And it's also to make people think about they're going into a new space.
Yes.
Which is then marked by milestones, which also commemorate the emperor. So the whole thing is a state monument, and a deeply ideological monument. And if you reread Statius's Sylvae, the poem Via Domitiana, it's entirely about the emperor, that archway and the road associated with it. What was the second bit, Mike?
The second is there any evidence of better quality builds nearer to the heart of empire and cheaper build in the further flung reaches?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's just like, so some roads are much better than others. The Via Appia is really good. The Via Flaminia is really good. The Via Aemilia is really good. Those are the main roads leading to Rome. And if you're going to put on the Arch in Rimini, the famous roads of Italy, they've got to be more famous than everywhere else. They've got to be maintained better. Otherwise, you're just failing.
Even when you get into northern Italy, Michele Mattiazzi has done his study in and around Padua. Once you get out of settlements, there are virtually no paved roads there at all.
Yeah, no, I mean,
and of course here they're almost non-existent.
Yeah, and we see sort of north of Rome, huge density of paved side roads to villas, but there is a huge abundance of volcanic stone in that region. So it may be not surprising. I mean, and I think further studies of south of Rome, we might get a better idea of the use of materials inside roads.
Yeah. I don't suppose you've got any plans or you're aware of any plans for anybody to actually do that?
We should, if we recruit 2 PhD students for this Dutch and us project, which they're coming here to sign various documents, the sort of vice chancellor level, next month. So
excellent.
That might produce something.
Right. We look forward to seeing that in 4 years' time or so.
Yes.
From G. Nixon, who worked in excavations at Nicopolis ad Istrum in Bulgaria. The streets inside the city were all paved. There wasn't any trace of a road surface robbed or otherwise beyond the city gates. We looked with geophysics and a field pickup survey and found nothing. The city was found under Trajan and survived into the Byzantine period, and seems never to have had a paved road outside its main gate. It was built immediately adjacent to a river, however, and then it stops. However,
I think it's kind of classic that, I mean, if we look back to Rome in the 3rd century BC, that what they do is they pave the roads inside the city. And that's a very sort of ideological thing. You also, for a certain extent, because the way you use the roads in the city is different from outside the city, that you're using the road as a public space for social interaction as well as for transport. Whereas if everything's about transport, I mean, what form of transport are we looking for? Are we looking for pack animals? If we're looking for pack animals, paving the road is not going to help. It actually almost hinders pack animals because there's less grip. And basalt has a habit of being really slippery when it's wet, and having taken groups of, let's say, the elderly around Italy, where the wet day on a basalt surface is a great day for falling over. They are really slippery, so they're not great for four-hoofed animals, for example. So, and we can also sort of think through other animals which are using the road, which like sheep, cattle, that it's actually not all about the transport of pottery and human goods. It's actually something which we need to see those human-animal relations much more clearly.
Yeah, we'll talk about human-animal relations. A question from Susan Rands, who incidentally lives pretty much on the Steingate. Is there a conflict between the high value placed on mules by the Romans and their use as draft animals? Is this potentially why camels were brought in?
I don't think there's a... I mean, the agricultural writers talk about farmers not being able to afford a mule and using a donkey instead. Donkeys are quite pretty, their utility is very high for basic farming activities, and compared with the cost of oxen, the mule is just a very much more improved breed. It's much stronger, stronger than a horse or a donkey, and has much more endurance than a horse. So obviously, as carriage drawing animals, they are perfect.
She'd actually ask at the end of that, but there was very quickly something came up in the chat which I didn't see. But she mentions one of the Vindolanda tablets that refers to movement by ox cart. I think she thought it was stone, but possibly not. Was asking whether they were used in Italy in the same way. Certainly, oxen were used in Italy. There's no question.
Yeah, they're certainly used, but they tend to cost a lot. They're actually sort of just very, very inconvenient animals to use. If you can use a mule, it will actually give you a better result. But for moving granite columns and things, you actually need large teams of oxen. Yeah. So it depends what you're moving. I mean, for most mobility, mules and donkeys work very effectively. I think there's probably a sort of the camel thing. I think there's almost a sort of sense of desperation of need for more and more animals. And I think that would be the motivation. Well, that's what I'm currently thinking. It's hypothetical because we're seeing the evidence of the use of camels and importation of camels from the 1st century AD. And they keep appearing on military sites at the frontier, particularly in the Danubian provinces. And it's a matter of time because people don't necessarily look at animal bones in, I mean, we think Roman roads are neglected. Animal bones from the Roman Empire are really neglected as a topic.
Yes. I haven't something nagging in the back of my mind that there is a scrap of evidence potentially for a camel being found here.
I think there's one in Britain, but I realized when I was driving in at sort of 6 a.m. that I had not a clue of the detail.
No, I can't. I really can't.
It's a case of sort of going, yeah, I should have looked at that yesterday and found it rather than. I'm pretty sure there is a camel bone from Britain.
I think there is. If anybody in the audience knows, please let us know. And moving on, I think we've just got one more.
Okay, we're nearly done.
From Malpien. Is there any evidence of toll payments, either at the arches or at other points along the roads? Could tolls be in either coin or goods?
There is evidence of customs duties and duties on materials going into a marketplace, duties on materials being moved into a town, more so than a toll on people using the road. Yes. So it's actually the goods, and there's no toll on the number of transport animals you're taking to a market. They're not. It's actually a toll on the number of sheep you might be selling in a market.
Yeah.
So it's slightly different. It's almost like a tax for using the market or using a town and we have custom boundaries at the borders of provinces in particular. So moving from one province to another will cost you money.
Yeah. Still coming. Rob, hope that was the last one. We've got another, Dylan Matthews, one of our regulars. Are there any examples of roads in Britain only being paved on one side? Short answer is no.
Right. Okay, I was glad that you didn't know, because I've never heard of one.
Well, there aren't really any examples outside of towns of roads being paved at all. There are claims of it, like the famous Blackstone Edge Road, which is hokum because it's 18th century.
Right.
But actual proof of paved roads in this country is slim, to say the least. Never rule it out, though. And from Bev, were roads used much for passenger traffic? We seem to have lost Ray.
I seem to be back.
Ah,
yeah. I disappeared from them, not sure why.
Did you catch the question?
No.
Were roads used much for passenger traffic? That's from Bev.
Oh, it's to work that one out. It's always a. I think we have to say that paved roads are actually designed for passenger traffic in a carriage. Mm-hmm. So they're designed for passenger traffic. And we have lots of letters of people. Pliny, who his hometown was up in Como, but if we look at his letters, they're all written to people on the road who live on the road from Como to Rome, which he goes up and down and obviously stays at their places. So there is a sense that it's set up for passenger traffic. It's also set up for the agents of the state, whether they're senators, whether they're military, whether the whole cursus publicus, which is not a post system, but is a system whereby the agents of the state, whoever they might be, can use the inn and get new horses at a very, very low cost. And that's something which is ideal for passenger traffic so that the empire can run itself.
We've had an answer to the issue with the British camel.
Okay, Camelback, Greenwich Park.
Yes, from William Costain and Tony Keane.
Right,
both
okay.
come up with the same thing. Camel teeth from Greenwich Park. Beyond that, nobody seems to know anymore. But so we weren't imagining things then. There
was a reality to it.
Yeah. And I think this will be the very last one.
Okay.
Which opens up another issue, really. It's from Anthony Wood. He's actually asking about Ray Selkirk's ideas. Oh, you've gone again.
Lord.
No, I'm still here.
Oh, your video dropped again briefly. He's asking about Ray Selkirk's ideas, specifically the Pierce Bridge formula. I'm not going to go into that because we really would be here till tomorrow. But the relationship between the road network and water transport is extremely important, and I think all too often underplayed. I don't know what your thoughts are that
I think it's something which we tend to compartmentalize roads as things which are just about the road, which is kind of a mistake, because you can only really understand them as connecting things, and they can connect cities, they can start at the ocean, they have a start point and an end point. Now, the end point being a river is perfectly logical, just as the end point can be the boundary of the province, because that's the end of the authority associated with that particular governor. So rivers being an end point is convenient. It's marking the landscape in terms of, yep, we stop at the river and we don't go any further. And then the road after that is a different thing. So the river marking a boundary or creating a junction in terms of sort of economic function as well. I mean, because after all, the number of towns in the Roman Empire which are on rivers is really high. It's much higher than we actually anticipate, because we started going through a list of 2,000 towns and found about 60% are on rivers.
Yes.
So rivers are incredibly important, but we actually need to see the relationship with city, river, road, rather than isolating any of them, really. So it's sort of integrating data more than anything else, rather than seeing a sort of very narrow vision of what we should study. Obviously, thousands more people should study roads, and that's just not going to happen. But that's
we can dream.
one of those things.
Yeah, I think you summed that up really, really well. I notice that Bev Knott has his hand up. Bev has difficulty with using the chat, so
Okay.
we let him ask his questions in person right at the end.
Okay. Hi, Bev.
Hi, Bev.
Hello, Ray. And can I say I loved your Roman roads of Italy, and this talk was brilliant as well. So thanks for all the stuff you do, and there are other books as well, I know. Anyway, my thing was going back to passenger transport. There are quite a lot of carvings of passenger vehicles, which would tend to make one think that it was quite an important part of the traffic. And in your book, I think I remember that there was a guild of Chiesiarii, which would be related to that. So I just wonder if you have any more thought than what you just said previously.
Okay. So I'm finishing editing a book called The Cultural History of Transport and Mobility, Volume 1, Antiquity. And in there's a chapter on visual representations. And there are so many representations of carts in particular, or carriages. We find them, in Ostia Antica, the number of mosaics which have a transport element to it, whether road or by sea, is really striking. It's really, really striking. Maybe not surprising me, because it's a city entirely about transport. But there's very few graffiti of carriages, whereas there are lots of graffiti of ships. So really sort of interesting of what's drawn and what's not drawn. I mean, there's lots of graffiti of gladiators, there's lots of graffiti of ships, but they seem to be much more the focus of the imagining of journeys. I mean, maybe we're picking it up from the wrong place, and since most of the graffiti is from Pompeii, which is a place associated with shipping more than anything else. But you're right, there is lots of representations. There's representations on coins and there's a recent book, because I haven't got any books on roads in my office, they're all at home. There's a recent book which goes through every representation of different sorts of carts in Latin literature. I think it's a Cambridge University Press book. I can't remember who did it, but you're right. There's a lot of representation, and we should see carriages as being perfectly normal things which people travel on. It's meant to be very good for your health, the bouncing as well.
Thank you so much. Yes.
You've disappeared again, right?
No, I'm still here.
It's your video. So yeah, I think it's Zoom that's doing it, not you. I'm not sure which book it is that you were thinking of, to be honest.
I could find it at home, but it's not here. It's just like it's a very recent one. It's for the last couple of years.
I think I must have missed that one. Cambridge University Press, you think?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Vehicles. Right. And I think that is just about it.
Okay. Well, happy sleep time. You guys. I've got a whole day ahead of me.
Yes, you have. And I can only thank you again for taking up so much time to talk to us at the beginning of a working day. time are we now? 20 to 9 your time. So
Yeah.
I don't know when your first horde of students arrives.
I haven't got any students today. I've got a few things. I've got a few external examiners to find for a PhD.
Right.
Amongst other things.
Getting lots of messages coming in the chat, thanking you for what was an absolutely fascinating talk.